Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we have an eye-opening conversation between Luke Gromen and Peter McCormack, which you surely don't want to miss out on.
Let me ask you an honest question. Do you think they know? Like the people making these decisions, I've often wondered whether it's the decisions are just because the economic cycle is out of kilter with the political cycle, and sometimes the decisions they're making is more for votes in that short-term retention of power. But I also wonder if the truth is to fix this, they have to make decisions where actually ultimately are worse for the people who hold most of the assets and the money in the world, if they actually know what they're actually doing.
I think there's a minority of them that know what they're doing. I think the majority of them are of policymakers in the West are simply going along with the zeitgeist of the era, continue to hold on to their seat, because as long as they hold on to their seat, they will continue to be enriched by the system and continue to hold a seat or continue to sort of progress. And it's sort of pretty classic human organization, sociology type stuff. There was very much, you go back to the late 90s, early 2000s, there was very much a zeitgeist. It was almost a religion, right? That globalism is good. All free trade is good. And yes, all else equal, trade is good, but you can't just have a free-for-all. There have to be rules, and you have to make sure that one party doesn't use it in their, use the system, use the parts of the rules that they want, and discard the rest to their advantage. And you need to have an honest measuring stick, right? As long as you're measuring, measuring in dollars, and one side can print the dollars, then ultimately you're going to have dollar Dutch disease, right? If the U.S. is going to be the Saudi Arabia of dollars and sort of the people that run the deficits to supply the dollars for everything, like that's great for the people sitting on the oil wells of dollars, so to speak, in Washington and Wall Street. But Dutch disease is where you see every other industry get hollowed out in deference to sort of the big natural resource and enriching resource. And that's what we've seen happen. So I think at the very highest levels, there's an understanding. I think initially, it's always this big trade-off, right? When the dollar system as it evolved started, it was great. It was necessary, number one. It was necessary to help us win the Cold War. After the USSR collapsed, we needed a restructuring of the system. And there was sort of this opportunity to sit down and say, what's this look like? Or we have a unipolar moment, let's just get rich, baby. And I think initially in the early 90s, there was a little bit of discussion around the former. And then by like the mid 90s, it was like, let's just all get rich. And, NAFTA, China, the WTO, globalize, greed is good, whatever, maximizing corporate profits is, the highest and best for mankind, and away we go. And I'm not saying I'm against higher corporate profits, but at some level, there's a tragedy of the commons problem that starts to happen. And in the short run, it's not very obvious and it's not fun to talk about and nobody cares. And then it's sort of, the devil takes the hindmost, where, ultimately your industrial base is sitting in China and your defense industrial base is sitting in China. You can't even make enough, shells to supply Ukraine, let alone Ukraine and Israel anymore. You've got, no longer a middle class. And oh, by the way, the middle class that you hollowed out is where political stability comes from, right? You take away middle class of society, that's the easiest and best way to destabilize a country politically, because you end up with increasingly extremist viewpoints. Well, nobody cared what was happening, but now here we are 20, 25, 30 years later. It's like, why is everyone so extreme? Well, it's like that meme, right? Of, you put a bullet in somebody and like, why is everybody, you put a bullet in the middle class? Of course there's, the political environment's getting increasingly extreme. That's what happens when you take away your stability. So I don't know, I'm kind of rambling here. I'll stop, but I think it's not easy to like, just say, hey, black, white, yes, that it's very shades of gray and.
Well, please do ramble because it's good. I enjoy listening to it. But are these kind of, are we seeing a repeat of things that have historically happened before? And in some ways, does that give you kind of then a window into what is coming next? Because like I say, every time we have, it's like when I talk to Lynn, every time I talk to her, when I talk to Preston Pish, when I talk to you, it feels like everything's got worse. The amount of borrowing's increased, and it's rapidly increasing. I'm seeing massive increase in the costs of goods here in the UK, whether it's your shopping or your fuel or your energy costs. I know people are struggling. I've got my lifeboat. I've been buying Bitcoin, and Danny's the same. And I know you're a gold bug, and you're not anti-Bitcoin as well. But the majority of people I know, I've got no lifeboat, and they don't see what's coming. And these are the kind of shows when afterwards, Luke, I send out. So like, guys, you need to listen to this. But what do you see coming? Yeah.
There needs to be, in the absence of an energy productivity miracle, right? We get nuclear fusion or portable nuclear fission, widespread, etc. The combination of peak cheap oil in particular, peak cheap commodities more broadly, and the levels of sovereign debt, and in particular Western sovereign debt, are fundamentally incompatible. And it's going to come down to a very simple choice that has happened with startling regularity across the long cycle, which is print or default. Here in the United States, for example, right now, tax receipts and the federal receipts over the last 12 months were roughly $4.4 trillion. We're going to spend $3.2 trillion on entitlements alone. That's health and human services and Social Security. So health, human services, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. We're going to spend another 5%, $3.4 trillion, pro forma, another $1.6 trillion. You're at $4.8 trillion on a pro forma basis against a tax base of $4.4 trillion. But wait, there's more. $900 billion in defense, and that's not getting any cheaper. And then that's just the three biggest items: entitlements, interest, and defense. Then we do everything else American government does: roads, labor, education, national parks, veterans affairs. One of the horrible downsides of being at war in the global war on terror, America is going to spend $300 billion this year in veterans affairs. $300 billion. And it ain't enough. It ain't enough for these guys. They should be spending $500, $600 billion. They're short in these guys. These men and women. But it gets back to, you look at the math, okay, giant tax increase. Well, we've tried a giant tax increase. We did it it was called Obamacare. We're gonna push the government's cost of healthcare onto people, whether they're gonna increase their premiums. Great. Basically reducing the deficit. Well, less than 18 months later, the deficit as a percent of GDP actually increased from when they passed Obamacare, which was designed to try to reduce the deficit as a percent of GDP. Why? Well, because before you were just like creating out of thin air. The government was paying for it all. When you actually make people pay for things and a tax increase, guess what? We're 2/3 GDP consumer. Hey, honey, my Obamacare premium went up 40%. We're not going to dinner. We're not getting a new car. We're not, so consumer spending fell, GDP slowed, tax receipts fell. And as tax receipts fell, they actually found that the deficit increased because a lot of the spending didn't. So that the receipts fell more than spending. So you're into this dynamic where we're still operating under the illusion that we can cut entitlements. And I hear that, there's a recognition. I've equated this to where we are now is like in 05 or 06 in the great financial crisis, right? So in probably like 06, maybe even 07. So for a while you had a few people saying, hey, housing bubble, housing market's going to collapse, banking system's at risk, right? And you're crazy. That's not going to happen. Whatever. And then by like 06, it was like, oh, okay, well, yeah, home prices are falling nationally, and it is a problem. It's not good, but it's only subprime, and subprime is contained. And that's kind of where we are now with this, and that the people who are saying, hey, there's a fiscal problem, it's going to be acute soon, people are like, okay. And like September of this year, all of a sudden, like a bunch of establishment economists were in like the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal going, whoa, the deficit just doubled. Like, what happened? Unemployment didn't fall. What? And sort of the people, myself, Lynn, others that were saying it was going to happen were sort of like, yeah, no shit. But there's that recognition of like, okay, it's starting to get acute, but it's not fully appreciative yet. There's still this view like, well, we're just going to have to cut entitlements. I would encourage people that are on the coasts of the United States thinking they can cut entitlements to come with me and live with me in Cleveland, in the U.S. Rust Belt, for a couple, 3 months. Because I think it's one of these unique things where somebody sitting in the Rust Belt in America has a much better sense of, like, if someone said, and I saw very famous, hedge fund manager saying, hey, they're going to have to cut entitlements. Like, it ain't going to happen. Like, you would come, like, spend, 2-3 months living day to day in the Rust Belt, and you'd like, oh my God, there is zero chance they're going to cut entitlements. It's not going to happen. It's just politically. And it reminds me a little of 2016, right? Where, like, literally a month before the election in 2016, I was in a coastal U.S. city, and they did a straw poll. Who's going to win the election? And, like, I didn't think Trump was going to win, but based on where I was sitting, I thought it was going to be really, really close. Everyone else thought it was going to be a landslide. It was funny. The straw poll, no one knew who voted, but there was one person who voted and said Trump was going to win. And, like, the whole room burst out in laughter, and then, like, spent the next 10 minutes of the conference making fun of the anonymous person who had said Trump was going to win 3 weeks before Trump won. And so it's a little bit of the same dynamic now of, well, they're just going to have to cut entitlements. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And so, in my opinion, so then what's left? Print the money, do the QE, slash defense, not slash and defense. All that's left is like, and that to me, it's like, that's why I say it's a little like the 06-07 time frame. I remember I had a buddy of mine that I worked with at the time, and he was, to his credit, was harping on the housing thing, harping on it. I mean, it was like to the point, it's like, all right, enough, dude. And he would, to his credit. And so finally, I got so sick of hearing it. I turned around on the sales desk. I said, do you realize if what you're saying is right, the banking system could collapse, the consumer's going to die. I mean, it's like the end of, and he's like, nah, well, maybe, okay, right? But it was so far-fetched. And it's a little bit of that same thing where he and I didn't believe at the time because the outcome was so bad. Like, oh my God, if that happened. And the answer now, of course, was like, yeah, the banking system was going to collapse. And they came in and they printed the money, etc. Like that was the right conclusion. And it's where I'm at now is the same thing. It's like, they're not going to cut the entitlements. They're going to print the money. And they're going to print the money with oil at 90 or 84 or wherever it is. And they're going to print the money with Bitcoin at 35,000. They're going to print the money. Like, they're going to print the money. And people say they wouldn't do that because that means then they're going to have to do yield curve control. And that means that you're going to have significant inflation. And the U.S. inflation is going to look like Argentina. And it's like, yeah, that's what's going to happen. Because there's only two things you can cut here in the U.S. Entitlements or interest. That's it. You can try to cut defense, right? Good luck being the guy who raises his hand right now and says, you know what? Let's give Israel and Ukraine a pat on the ass, tell them, hey, go get them, guys, and leave. It ain't gonna happen.
In this conversation, Peter McCormack and macro analyst Luke Gromen uncovered the hidden dynamics between political decisions and economic realities. They discussed the impact of globalism on the middle class, the looming fiscal crisis, and why policymakers might be steering us towards inevitable inflation. This eye-opening discussion offered insights that will change how you view the world economy. Luke's arguments about the intricate link between political decisions and economic outcomes take center stage in this conversation. He explored the historical impact of globalism and the dominance of the US dollar, underscoring their effects on the middle class and political stability. Luke's analysis forewarns of impending inflation as policymakers face the critical choice between printing money or implementing stringent cuts to government spending. The three main lessons from this conversation are: 1. Policymakers often prioritize short-term political gains over long-term economic stability, potentially leading to unsustainable policies that harm the economy in the future. 2. Globalisation and the dominance of the US dollar have hollowed out the US industrial base and contributed to a decline in the middle class, fostering political instability amidst widening economic disparities. 3. With high sovereign debt and a reliance on cheap commodities, the US may resort to printing money rather than making politically challenging cuts, risking significant inflation akin to historical examples like Argentina. So, what do you think about this Bitcoin conversation? Do you agree with Luke and his arguments? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoy this type of content and want to see more, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to our channel. Until next time, keep learning and keep stacking.